Alright, if you're watching this, you're probably running into this idea of a fallacy, and maybe you're a little bit confused about how that term's being used, especially if you're in maybe a philosophy class, a critical thinking class, or a logic class, maybe a rhetoric, communications, or an English class where you're talking about persuasive writing or rhetoric. You might run into this term, and because this term gets used in a few different ways, especially in casual conversation or in popular media, you might be a little confused about how it's being used in your textbook or in more technical material here. So, what is a fallacy? So, the first thing we got to know is that fallacies are arguments gone bad. And so, when we talk about an argument, we also have something pretty specific in mind. An argument's a group of propositions, at least one of which, the premise, is said to support the truth of the other, the conclusion. So, right off the bat, we kind of know that by an argument here, we don't mean just a clash of opinions or a disagreement or a conflict between two people. We have in mind the group of propositions or the reasoning that those two people might give each other or to even themselves to convince them or persuade them of a certain truth or a certain claim. So arguments have three main parts to them. They have at least one premise, they have a conclusion, and then they have an alleged link between the premise and the conclusion. So the premises, they express the reasons for or the evidence for the truth of the conclusion. So if the premises are true, then if the argument's set up correctly, we should think that the conclusion, the truth of the conclusion, follows from the truth of those premises. So here we have an example, a classic example of an argument in proper or standard form. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is, and you can probably fill it in for yourself rather quickly, Socrates is mortal, right? So there's an example of an argument in standard or proper form. You might be thinking to yourself, well, you've talked about fallacies like there's some kind of impartial way to adjudicate arguments, but really, all arguments are just in the eye of the beholder. What's a good argument to you might be a bad argument to me, and vice versa, and there's no way to adjudicate that kind of dispute. It's a natural thing that many people think, but let's take a look at that. So here, we've got our original argument, right? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, thus Socrates is mortal. And then we get another argument. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates likes jazz. Well, pretty clearly, all men being mortal and Socrates being a man doesn't really imply anything about whether Socrates likes jazz or any other kind of music at all, or anything about his musical taste or aesthetic preferences. The conclusion in argument 2 doesn't follow from the premises, even if they are true, the way that the conclusion in argument 1 does follow from the premises that are in that argument. So, reasoning errors. Fallacies are reasoning errors. In order for an argument to, kind of strictly speaking here, be a good argument, it needs to meet two basic conditions. The premises have to be true, right? This gets to why we have maybe a more technical use of the term philosophy here, because by fallacy, we don't mean just false premises. And secondly, the argument has to be inductively strong or deductively valid, and this gets us closer to the idea of a fallacy. If the argument is inductively weak or deductively invalid, then it's a fallacious argument. We're looking for arguments that are sound or cogent, meaning they're deductively valid with true premises, and they're strong arguments with true premises. It's a cogent argument. We want to avoid deductively invalid or inductively weak argument. There again, fallacious argument. So again, you might hear this term fallacy getting used to refer to false statements sometimes, but in the material that I assign in my classes and that you're likely to encounter in a philosophy class, they're going to have this other meaning in mind much of the time. So it's important to know about that. An argument, again, if it's inductively weak or deductively invalid, then it's fallacious. So another way of thinking about fallacies, in fact, sometimes people use the term non sequitur to mean a particular fallacy in itself, or sometimes people might use that more broadly to just simply mean it does not follow. The truth of the conclusion does not follow from the truth of the premises. So that gets us to our basic idea here. That a fallacy, it's faulty reasoning or faulty argumentation, but not due to a false premise. It's due to something else about the argument. Well, what else about it? It's the problem is that there's a gap between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. Notice I didn't say there's obviously a gap between false premises and the truth of the conclusion, but here we're worried about a gap, a logical gap, or disconnect really, between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. So again, a fallacy is an argument such that even if the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. And of course, there are a lot of different kinds of fallacies. You'll be learning probably, if you're watching this video enough to be this worried about how to use this term fallacy and what they're getting at in some of your reading assignments maybe, or in discussing philosophy with your friends. You're going to run into different fallacies, right? So formal fallacies are errors in reasoning that have to do with the underlying structure of the argument where there's a flaw, affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, or examples of that kind of fallacious reasoning. Again, it has to do with the underlying structure of the argument. And then informal fallacies, they have more to do with the content and the context of the argument rather than simply its underlying structure. And here you might run into fallacies of relevance, like the ad hominem fallacy, fallacies of weak induction, like slippery slope, or fallacies of ambiguity, like equivocation. And while formal fallacies only occur in deductive reasoning and formal logic, informal fallacies can occur in any kind of reasoning, deductive or inductive reasoning, even though some of them are just called fallacies of weak induction. In fact, let's end with an example of a slippery slope to give you an idea about that sort of fallacy. All right, hope you got something out of this, and check out the other videos for help with other concepts in logic.